Hello everyone, and thanks for joining the show. I'm Narek Terzian, and I'm joined today by Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar at the Columbia Global Center for Energy Policy. Thank you for joining us, Anne-Sophie.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. I'm actually super excited to have you here with us. I've been wanting to do this, to have this conversation with you for a while. Lucky for me, you've been very productive in the meantime, and if anything, it was more difficult than it would have been to sort of narrow it down to what we could talk about today. But I think it's a good moment to have a conversation about the gas markets in general, be they a bit global and European. But most important, so we're in April 2024. I think it's just important for our listeners to know that. So it's just over 2 years after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's also the second winter after the invasion that Europe is going through. And it's the end of withdrawal season. So not a bad moment just to look also a bit more specifically at what happened over the last winter. But there are three things that we wanted to cover today. The first is European gas market developments, looking back at what happened since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, 2023, also where we are today. The second thing is industrial gas demand trends. You co-authored a commentary recently, and I found that very interesting. So to bring the insights of that, to our listeners, I think would be extremely important. And because it's an election year across the world, but also in Europe with the European elections in just a few weeks now, what would be your recommendations or things for European policymakers to have in mind? With everything else being said, what they should be looking out for. Is Europe out of the woods? Everybody seems to be very confident these days. Is that confidence well-placed or misplaced? Would love to hear your thoughts about that. So I think we should just jump straight into it with perhaps that first part about European gas market development. So I guess just looking back, again, we're in 2024. If you look back at 2022, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit, what is it that made 2022, the gas crisis of 2022, so severe? Because it was severe, and you brought interesting data to light to show the extent to which that impacted the market. But what were the factors that made it so severe?
So what made the crisis in 2022 so severe was the fact that we had a crisis on top of a crisis. So we were already in a crisis mode before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And it was driven by basically 6 factors. 4 were related to demand and 2 to supply. So on the demand side, we had first the economic recovery, which increased the demand for fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and coal in 2021. The second thing is that we had very unusual weather events. If you remember, we had very cold weather in Asia at the beginning of 2021. We had also a very long winter in Europe as well. And we had also a very cold episode in Texas in February 2021. So colder weather usually means that we have higher heating demand for natural gas. Then we had also very strange things happening in terms of the renewable. For example, there were droughts. For example, a drought in Brazil, which also led to an increase in gas demand for power generation. We had much lower wind generation in Europe in spring 2021. Also, as a result of that, you increase gas demand in the power generation. And in general, all the prices for commodities were increasing. Oil prices were increasing, coal prices were increasing, and also carbon prices were increasing. So these are the 4 factors on the demand side. On the supply side, we had some issues, more issues than usual on the LNG side. Force majeure, things which were not quite expected. Incident like Snøhvit, for example, in Norway, was out for more than a year, starting in October 2020. So all that basically decreased the availability of LNG on the global market. And then we had Russia. But you can consider that, Russia was basically, the last element. All these elements together was the fact that, this is what contributed to aggravate the crisis. Individually, they would have probably led to a small increase in prices, But the combination of these 6 elements together was what made this crisis particularly difficult. And what Russia did was, at the very beginning, well, in April, we started to wonder, why is Russia not sending more natural gas to Europe? Because there is definitely demand for natural gas and prices were increasing. And they were saying, the winter has been particularly tough in Russia. We need to refill storage. Okay, fair enough. And then, step by step, you could see that there was something strange happening. And on top of that, it was happening with the discussion on Nord Stream 2 in the background. And then, Russia basically stopped selling gas on the spot market. And then we had the invasion. But this was basically, the last thing. All the factors that I have quoted together contributed to the crisis.
So perfect storm, various factors, post-COVID industrial demand, but just in general demand recovery, supply issues, and a geopolitical, massive geopolitical problem that aggravated the whole thing in
Absolutely.
2022.
So we were already in a market which was extremely tight. Everything was tight. Coal, oil, gas was very tight. We had never seen prices at $30 per MMBTU like we had in September, October 2021 before. I mean, I had seen in the past maybe, prices going above 20 on a couple of occasions. And, this is over 20 years of career. So that was totally unexpected. So we were in a crisis mode. And on top of that, you are adding probably the worst supply crisis that the European market could face, which is potentially losing the largest gas supplier, because Russian gas was about 40% of total demand. So the demand in 2021 was about 400 billion cubic meters. Russia was contributing pipeline and LNG together for about 155. So this was massive. And of course, we didn't lose everything immediately. We are still importing Russian gas, by the way. But the fact is that the European Commission, at the very beginning, just after the invasion, said, okay, we are going to reduce our imports of Russian gas.
Through the REPowerEU plan?
Exactly. So that was the plan which was published at the beginning of March, which was saying, okay, by the end of 2022, we are going to reduce our imports of Russian gas by 2/3, equivalent to about 100 billion cubic meters, which is absolutely huge.
Massive endeavor.
Massive, absolutely massive.
Okay, thank you. The year that followed, 2023, was a bit different. And I think at the end of 2022, before the winter, obviously everybody was extremely stressed out. After the winter, so in 2023, things were already a bit different. People were more, I guess, worried still, but perhaps the feeling in Europe in general was a bit different. Again, what was that due to? What was different in 2023? Again, looking back, not just necessarily in March or April 2023, but now that we can look back at what happened last year, why was it so different?
I think there was one main reason, but several others. The main reason for why we were actually quite relaxed, or the mood was totally different, was the fact that we had a very mild winter 2022-2023. It's actually quite ironic that the weather started to be very mild the very day that the price cap mechanism was actually agreed by the European Commission on the 19th of December. And you can see that from that moment, gas prices started to really go down and go below 100 euro per megawatt hour. So that's a little bit ironic. But that was, something that people were really concerned about was the fact that we could have extremely cold weather. And, it's very difficult to say to people, well, stop heating. Of course, we had all these, gas-saving measures, etc., but the thermostat at 90 degrees. But if the weather is very cold, people will have to heat nonetheless. So there was a lot of concern about that. So the fact that we had a very mild weather helped a lot. Also, industrial gas demand dropped significantly in 2022, did not recover in 2023, despite lower gas prices. And one also massive difference between 2022 and 2023 was what was happening in the power sector. So in 2022, we didn't really manage to reduce gas demand in the power sector. Why? Because we lost a lot of nuclear generation and hydro generation. So altogether, it was about 180 terawatt hours that we lost. And that was first unexpected, to some extent. I mean, definitely hydro generation is not something that you can expect maybe at the beginning of the year. A little bit of the nuclear generation should have been foreseen, even if I remember that at the beginning of the year, it was very strange. At the beginning of 2022, there were some people who were saying, oh, we can count on increasing nuclear generation. And I had to write a short note saying, no, not absolutely. Absolutely no, this is not going to happen. So that was one big element in 2022. However, in 2023, what happened is that, first of all, nuclear stopped dropping. And also, we had a recovery of hydro generation. So this, along with a drop in power demand, basically led to the fact that we had gas and coal-fired generation dropping. And of course, I need to add the fact that wind and solar were increasing. But when we compare 2022, the increase in wind and solar generation was not sufficient to compensate for the lower generation from hydro and nuclear, while in 2023, it definitely contributed to help the situation.
Okay. In that period, 2022 to 2023, what happened on the gas industry side, be it, domestic production or supplies to Europe? Did we see anything shift in particular over that period?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was massive. We lost almost 80 billion cubic meters of Russian pipeline gas. I mean, again, this was starting from a 400 billion cubic meters market. Of course, the reduction in gas demand was also very significant. We lost about 50 billion cubic meters from one year to another. So that's kind of unprecedented. And we actually continue to lose some demand in 2023 as well. We also increased our imports of LNG in an incredible fashion. I mean, it's fair to say that LNG came to the rescue of Europe, absolutely, and we have to thank the fact that LNG is relatively flexible. It was not easy because people said at the very beginning, there is, and I was the first to agree, there is more than enough LNG import capacity in Europe as a whole. However, nobody had actually quite anticipated a massive supply shock where we are losing our main supplier. So taking that into account and taking also the fact that some of this import capacity is not particularly well placed. A lot is in Iberia, which is not very well connected to the rest of Europe. A lot is in the United Kingdom. Also, I mean, we actually imported quite a lot from the United Kingdom, something which is not always taken into account, but we actually imported a lot more from the United Kingdom, about 20 BCM more compared to usual. So the UK basically served as a transit country for LNG towards Europe. But all this LNG capacity that we had was not enough. So we had to build a lot of additional regas capacity, notably in Germany, which was, the country which was the most impacted, but also the country which had absolutely no LNG import capacity before. So yes, I know we are building quite a lot now. We don't know for how long they are going to be necessary, but, this is security of supply. So what do you want to do? Do you want to tell people that they have to freeze in the dark, or do you want to actually invest a little bit more to ensure security of supply? I think security of supply is very important now. Yes, we have paid a very, very, very high cost. So that's for sure. Absolutely high cost.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because what was striking to me is that somehow the notion of the need for redundancies had escaped people's mind, and it came back so strongly. The fact that having that redundancy, that extra capacity, be it as in the power generation side or in the import capacity, and in our conversations with policymakers these days, I think it's something they're looking at, whereas before there was this idea of a linear, controlled, decrease in all energy demand, and it's okay, we can decommission stuff as we go, and we can phase out certain fuels or whatever. But that factor of redundancy just it was such a stark reminder of the need to having that extra capacity. I personally found that quite interesting, and I can already see that the mindset is changing and people are seeing the need for that today. If you look at what's happening, so 2024 today, as I mentioned maybe before, we're coming out of the withdrawal season. Everybody is very relaxed.
Absolutely.
What is happening on the market in 2024? Why is everyone so relaxed? And I guess the question is, are they right? But I mean, we can follow up on that later. But so what's different now in 2024?
So we still have relatively low demand in the industrial sector. It has been recovering slightly, but definitely not enough. We had also relatively mild winter again. So, residential gas demand has not been particularly high. We continue to see an increase in renewable generation. So taking everything together, people are quite relaxed because gas demand is not going to increase massively in Europe. And on top of that, I mean, we are going out of winter with storage, which are even at a higher level than last year. So this is helping. On the supply side, we are continuing to get a lot of LNG from global gas market. Demand is picking up, but maybe not very strongly so far in Asia. We have to watch China. We have to be very careful. There have been some difficulties there and there with some LNG suppliers, some difficulties, for example, right now with Freeport, but, nothing really massive. What is important, however, is that 2024 is not going to be a year of massive increase in LNG supply. First, because the only big plant which was expected to come online, which has actually come online, this is Arctic LNG 2, is facing quite a lot of issues, especially with the LNG cargoes. So I don't think they are going to significantly contribute to the LNG supply. The other additional LNG suppliers, for example, Congo FLNG, Senegal and Mauritania, they're relatively small LNG plants. So they are not going to bring a lot of additional supply. The big additions are going to come towards the end of the year, probably with Corpus Christi, with Plaquemine in the United States. But, knowing that they come at the end of the year, they are not going to increase massively the LNG supply. So that's something to understand, to take into account. But at the same time, I think, we are seeing the prices are quite low, 26 euro per megawatt hour. So remember, in August 2022, we went up to 340 euro per megawatt hour. So we are in a much, much, much lower price environment. That doesn't mean that we should be totally relaxed. I mean, we are still a war, just outside of Europe. We have absolutely no idea what could happen. We have been using Ukrainian storage, which until now was fine, but it was recently targeted. So we don't know to what extent we may be able to continue to use that. There's been a lot of unrest in the Middle East. Months ago, people were quite worried about, seeing the conflict between Israel and Hamas extending towards Iran and maybe, the Strait of Hormuz. What we can see for sure is that, using the Canal of Suez is not a good idea these days. So there is a lot of, longer routes that LNG has to take, especially coming from Qatar. So you have to be, mindful of the global environment, not to take, security of supply for granted. Something can always happen. And especially when I'm looking at LNG, I always had in my forecast some sort of, Murphy law. Something somewhere is going to happen. Well, we had already a little bit of that with Freeport, but hey, something else can happen. The problem is, how big is that something else?
Yeah, it's great you mentioned that, because I was gonna, my final question on this specific theme was, when you look at, so how do you feel Europe is prepared to, so you mentioned a number of risks. How do you feel Europe is prepared? Because I see some complacency personally. It's a feeling, it's not a fact. It's the way I perceive it. But I would like to hear your expert view on you said they're confident about demand, sort of not exploding, from one day to another. But on the supply side, you mentioned a number of severe risks, and there's probably others as well that we haven't even thought about. But how do you think do you think they're prepared? Do you think or what you hear, the signals you're seeing, what is that giving you? Sense of confidence, or are you worried when you?
I am always very careful, also because I used to work for the IEA, and, at the IEA, security of supply is always very important. So, we were talking about the infrastructure, for example, and the importance of redundancy. I mean, it's not redundancy, it's planning and using the N-1 factor. So this is very important for us. But to come back to the current situation, There's still risk also on the demand side. The weather in winter can be cold. We have been lucky I don't know whether you can call that luck actually, but we have been lucky over the past 2 winters. We could have also a very, very hot summer, which usually means, more demand for air conditioning, which means potentially more demand for gas-fired generation, especially if hydro and nuclear generation are impacted. So these are also things that you need to take into account. Industrial gas demand, I think we will come back to that, but I don't think this is going to recover very fast and massively. That's for sure. So that's something that I think, people understand. What is better at a European level is the fact that we are now really monitoring what is happening. That was already happening before, but I think, because of all the crises that we have been going through, people are really looking very carefully at the market now.
Okay, thank you. And I was also, I couldn't help but notice a difference so this is again on the supply maybe side of things, where the Commission seems to want to, with climate, objectives in mind, and just within that framework of, gradually phasing out gas, replacing gas with renewables, with alternatives, with energy efficiency, of course, etc. What I hear these days, despite the much more relaxed environment as you described, is policymakers are keen to avoid as much as possible long-term commitments with suppliers. This is what I'm hearing from them. On the other hand, we hear suppliers who are, saying, we can provide you with the gas to substitute Russian volumes, but we want those long-term contracts. And, number 2027, I think, has become the new sort of magic number. But there is this disconnect between expectations, on both sides. What does that mean for you? And, is there any way to reconcile that, you feel?
So that's a very good question. And, when I was looking at that 2 years ago, I was receiving quite a lot of phone calls coming from the United States, people asking, why are the Europeans not signing long-term contracts? And they were not talking about the government, because last I checked, governments don't sign long-term contracts. It's the companies which sign long-term contracts. And the companies are a little bit reluctant to sign long-term contracts because, hey, if you are basically saying, I'm going to commit for 20 years, but that you have this long-term net zero target, what are you going to do? Especially if you are signing for a plant which is going to start in 2027, 2028. I mean, you are moving very, very close to the net zero target. So what is going to be the gas demand in Europe by then? So that's why I think a certain number of European companies have been quite reluctant to sign long-term contracts. It's not so much the government. I mean, it's because the government is setting these decarbonization targets. But otherwise, I think, this is basically coming also from the companies. Some of them have, of course, signed long-term contracts because, they need to replace the Russian gas volumes, in particular, a certain number of gas companies in Germany, EnBW, Uniper, etc., have signed long-term contracts. So we can see that. And the volumes are small enough that this is manageable. And especially when you are signing LNG contracts, you can always hope that these volumes are going to be rediverted towards other markets. What was particularly important with the Qatari volumes, and this is interesting that you are indeed quoting the 27 numbers, the 27 year, because these contracts have a very unusual duration. It's very rare that we have seen contracts for more than 20 years in the LNG business. And most of the contracts which were signed by Qatar with a certain number of players have been for 27 years. So first of all, these are DES contracts. They even mention sometimes the LNG import terminal where it's going to be imported. I think it was more a political statement from the Qatari side saying, okay, you see, Europeans, you do need LNG, you do need that on a long-term basis. And I think they wanted to make a statement vis-à-vis the politicians because they were quite annoyed, especially by the Germans who didn't want to commit at the very beginning, in the early days of the crisis, for more than 10, 15 years. And, for the Qataris, this is absolutely unthinkable. They were a little bit, outraged by the German behavior.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting to hear your thoughts about that. I want to take us, maybe you hinted at the industrial demand side, and so you recently co-authored with your colleague Akos Losh, if I hope I didn't mispronounce his name, a commentary which I found really interesting, and you called it the anatomy of the European industrial gas demand drop. Now, in Brussels, we keep hearing these celebrations of drop in gas demand. Well, of course, these are seen in in the context of trying to reduce dependency on Russia. But I can't help but feel that people miss the actual impact or what this loss or reduction in demand actually causes, or how it happens in the first place. And I'm very I'm glad that you wrote this paper, because I think you really pointed at a key question here, which is industry in general really helped by, unfortunately, having to reduce output to substitute the loss of Russian volumes. But that is not, we're talking about it now. There's new, competitiveness is back on the agenda in Europe. Of course, it's an election period, but I think people generally are more keen to look at this as a more balanced manner, in a balanced climate and competitiveness policy. But so with that in mind, why did you look at it? You mentioned a couple of things earlier, but what is it that prompted you to look at this?
I think from the very beginning, when I was looking at European gas demand in the industry dropping, I was like, is it going to recover or not? And that was, basically the main question. Also, I do remember I was in Germany in September 2022, and I remember a German official celebrating the fact that industrial gas demand in his country had dropped by, I can't remember, a very impressive number, 2 digits, definitely. And I was absolutely shocked because, this is not fuel switching, this is not energy efficiency, it was industrial gas demand destruction. So I don't think you should celebrate destruction, because eventually that means that you have lower industrial output, that maybe, some industries can be threatened. So I was a little bit perplexed when I heard that. And that reinforced my idea, okay, we really need to look into that. Then, as we entered into 2023 and prices started to be lower, there was really the question, okay, prices are lower now. What is happening with industrial gas demand? Is it going to recover or not? And actually, it has not recovered in 2023. It has actually dropped even further. So, for example, we were looking at the gas demand in different countries, and we could notice that industrial gas demand had dropped even more from 2022 to 2023. So that is not a particularly great sign. I should say, however, that since October, there is a sign of recovery. So on a monthly basis, when you are comparing with the previous year, you can see industrial gas demand recovering by anywhere between 10 to 18%. So that's for the period from October to January, which seems to be a good sign. However, the recovery in February, what we have with the first statistics, is only plus 3%. So, to what extent are we really seeing a very strong recovery? In the paper, we argue that there are a certain number of factors which, in our opinion, are pointing towards a moderate industrial gas demand recovery. Yes, it's going to recover, but it's not going to come back to the previous levels, because there are, general macroeconomic factors. I mean, we cannot say that the economic outlook in Europe is looking fantastic, right? I mean, for sure. I mean, look at, the economic forecast for big countries such as France, or in particular Germany. Germany is a key country to watch when we are looking at the industrial sector and industrial gas demand in particular. The second thing is that a lot of the companies which were impacted by the crisis, there are different types of long-term contracts. They were sometimes having contracts for fixed prices, sometimes, fixed prices covering only part of their demand. So you cannot say with certainty, okay, every single company has been impacted the same way. They were also using different tools such as hedging in order to go through this period. But of course, after a while, all these tools are expiring. I think we are at the end of them. There was also quite a lot of support coming from European government, and we analyzed that, and we saw that indeed, this had contributed to help a little bit these companies. But now I think the governments, they are not going to support a lot longer because, everywhere we have quite high deficits. So if you take into account everything, a relatively, moderate growth in terms of, economy, the fact that all the tools that we were using before hedging, etc., I think are pretty much expired. Now you need to look at where the prices are, and the prices are where they are. But the forward curve is not particularly indicating a rapid drop in prices. That's actually very interesting given all the capacity which is coming to the market. And finally, I don't think the governments are going to put even more money right now to help specific sectors because of high deficits. And then you couple that with the fact that in Europe we are still seeing higher prices than in the US, for example.
Right, I was going to ask you about that.
US is our ally, but it's also a key competitor. And, gas prices in the US, in the Middle East, when you are looking at a certain number of sectors, chemical sectors, etc., they are very low. So what we could see for, especially for the chemical sector, which is a very key sector for, industrial gas demand, that there is competition coming from outside, that the products that we could have produced domestically are undercut by imports coming from elsewhere. Notably coming from the United States, but also possibly from other regions and countries. So that's something to take into account. And when you look at, iron and steel, at non-metallic minerals, at aluminium, you can see that there is definitely competition coming from imports. And that is not going to go away. If anything, more and more there is going to be this question about the future of energy-intensive industries. Whether you are looking at natural gas or whether you are looking in the future at hydrogen, it's going to be exactly the same kind of question.
Okay. And so having that in mind, what should European leaders, what can they do? What should they do, but what can they do to try and safeguard that industrial base in Europe, which, as you said, is still eroding despite a more favorable situation on, in this case, the gas markets. Do they have any cards in their hands still that they can play? What is and what would you recommend them to do to make up for this situation, for this competitive disadvantage that you very well described?
I think you need to look at where we can have value added, where in terms of employment but also economic growth it makes more sense. I think there were also some comments recently from certain number of industrial players that if a company is not able to sustain itself in the long term because it's totally uncompetitive compared to others, then it should disappear. Now there is this very important question. What are, the sectors that we may choose to no longer support as we were before? But what are also the sectors that we need to support? Because, in my home country, France, we are talking a lot about reindustrialization and especially reshoring some activities, because during COVID, we discovered, oh my God, we are no longer producing anything which is absolutely essential. So there is this very delicate balance about, cost-benefit analysis of what we need to have in-house, within Europe, because we may be at risk, maybe from a health perspective or other perspectives. We are talking a lot about critical minerals these days. Because, the countries that we are dealing with, I think there are a lot of worries about China, but sometimes, there are also some concerns about, other regions in the world. They may be okay now, but they may no longer be okay. So you need to look at the sectors one by one, assess, the health of the companies, understand how they are going to transition towards a decarbonized economy and whether it makes sense or not to help them and to support them. And it was very interesting, I think it was a few months ago, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, went to Mauritania. And she said, Mauritania has a lot of iron ore and has also a lot of potential for renewable hydrogen. So therefore, in Europe, we could import green steel coming from Mauritania. And I was like, that's interesting that the president of the European Commission is saying that. What are the implications for the steel industry in Europe then? Because, this is exactly what we should be producing. Now, and this is exactly what I was saying at the annual gathering of AOICA, the energy-intensive users in Germany. What do you want to import? Do you want to import renewable hydrogen, knowing that it's going to be much more expensive than another country? Do you want to import HBI, hot briquette iron, which is a semi-finished product, but then you can basically finish and produce more elaborated steel within Europe, or do you want to import green steel? But then in that case, what is your future?
It's I can't help but think that the window is very small actually, because while this, despite the fact that we're in a much better situation in terms of the gas markets, that lack of a signal from the European leadership, I feel like is preventing, as you said yourself earlier, the buyers from taking those commitments. Do you think that if this was to happen faster, or perhaps it's maybe more a matter of being more consistent in the way it's communicated from the leadership? I mean, we still see impact assessments with assumptions that basically indicate that there's going to be very little, if any, gas demand in the future. But what about decarbonized gas? I can't help but feel like there's a disconnect between the actual need and indeed industry moving out of Europe because of the competitiveness disadvantage and because of the lack of or maybe the uncertainty that prevails, and the discourse of European leadership, which is still, or maybe the not appropriate action. I'm not sure how to frame this, but what's your perspective on that?
I think, for example, when REPowerEU was published just after the crisis, it was a very important document which had very ambitious targets. The problem is that the targets are extremely ambitious and too ambitious, and it's very difficult to do planning on that. So, the implications for natural gas demand, if you take, for example, REPowerEU at face value, well, gas demand is going to be very low in 2030 and even lower going forward. So we don't need to do that much investments. However, because we know that we are not going to reach these targets, we don't know exactly where gas demand is going to end up. And there is a lot of discussion. So right now we are at 320 billion cubic meters in the European Union. Where are we going to be? 250 billion cubic meters, 300 billion cubic meters. And this is very, very important because, for example, when we are having this discussion with US LNG suppliers and they are saying, but Europe needs more LNG. Well, first of all, it depends where our demand is going to be. And honestly, I don't have any clarity about where our demand is going to be by 2030 at all right now. I mean, if I had better understanding on where we can be in terms of wind generation, in terms of solar generation, what is achievable in terms of energy efficiency, which is always a poor parent. I mean, on paper, everybody agrees energy efficiency is fantastic. When it comes to have agreements, sure as hell, you are going to have, a downgrade of the energy efficiency targets because at the end of the day, this is pretty difficult. You need to go house by house and, basically renovate everything. And we all know that this is pretty complicated. So we need to have reality check about what we can actually achieve. And this is also including problems such as building the transmission lines because you can have, very ambitious targets in terms of the renewable. However, if there are no transmission lines to connect them, and we know that this is a big problem, then we are going nowhere. And also same thing for hydrogen. these 20 million ton, which were, I don't know, coming from where, but they are kind of misleading. Everybody outside of Europe is saying, oh, Europe is going to import 10 million tons of hydrogen by 2030. Yep, really? I mean, I am not so sure about that. And please tell me exactly what we are going to import. Are we going to import pipeline hydrogen? Are we going to import ammonia? What are we exactly going to import? Because this is basically, putting people on a path of crazy assessments and very high ambitions. And in the end, I am not quite sure where we are going. And this is actually coming back to, in terms of hydrogen, what are we actually importing, which is, a paper that I published last year. Are we going to import hydrogen or derivatives, or are we going to import semi-finished products? That's also a very important question. So, rather than doing pie in the sky, super ambitious scenarios, where are we going? There are 6 years between now and 2030. So we should be able to have a relatively good assessment. Well, assuming that, we are not moving into another crisis. We didn't talk about one thing which is going to happen at the end of the year, and I don't think we have solved it. This is what is going to happen with the Russian contract. Okay, I should say.
A very important point. Yeah, thank you for bringing that.
The contract, as it stands, is not going to be extended. There is no way we are going to put Ukraine, Russia, and European countries at the same table. So that's over. The question is whether there is going to be gas flowing through Ukraine with potentially European buyers contracting the capacity of Ukraine transmission in order to get the gas flowing. When I post that on LinkedIn, I seem to get slightly different answers. There are some people who are saying, yeah, of course, no problem at all, it can be done. And some people are saying, why should we actually enable Russian gas to continue to flow through Ukraine while we're at war? So, the Europeans should have sorted their problems out. It has been more than 2 years now, almost 3 years. And I respect that. The problem is that, from a European perspective, we need clarity. If the Ukrainians are saying no more gas flowing through Ukraine, sorry, this is over, then fine. But, we need to act now. They're about 9 months. So that Slovakia and Austria, which are the countries which are the most at risk, are not facing a big problem in 2025. I don't think there is an immediate issue, but we need to be prepared and we need to understand exactly how the gas is going to flow towards these landlocked countries. But we need to be prepared now, rather than, okay, is it a yes or a no? Because honestly, I have respect, for the Ukrainians. I am not going to argue with them. If they don't want to have the gas transiting, fair enough. I'm not going to blame you. You are at war with Russia. But tell us, if this is no, this is no. Fine. And then, we need to sort the European mess, especially with some countries like Germany who want to make, the transit fees higher for countries which are going to be landlocked. So there has been quite a lot of discussions on that a few months ago. Right. But we need clarity. Because otherwise, this is going to be a little bit like the nuclear in Germany, which I said in March 2022, there is still time to actually keep these nuclear power plants operating, which I think we should have done. But of course, by the time everybody woke up, it was too late. So now we have 9 months. Yes, no, what are we doing? And if no more gas, fair enough, then what is going to happen and how do we get the gas towards Slovakia and Austria? I am sure there are a lot of very intelligent people in Brussels who have already solutions, but we need to make sure that these solutions are going to work in December 2024, period, end of the story.
Okay. One last question, because I was in a conversation in the European Parliament about one of the rare upcoming domestic production projects in Europe. I wanted to ask if this is something you monitor even remotely. I don't think anybody has any illusions that Europe is going to become sufficient in production. But I'm just wondering, do you, in the overall picture, right, of the supply picture of gas to Europe, what is your view on, is Europe using that enough? Can the leadership do more to incentivize that more? What's your perspective?
So were you talking about Tyra in Denmark?
No,
were you
actually,
talking about Romania?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
I was
yeah.
wondering because, in Denmark, they just restarted a field which had been, closed for a couple of years in order to revamp the whole facilities. And of course, we have this potential in Romania. And that's something that, yes, I am monitoring. So when I am looking at, European gas production, I am, taking that as a part of supply, which is very important. And this is part of the overall, domestic supply that is going to come from Europe. So there are two things. There is a traditional natural gas and there is a biomethane. And here as well, we have the 35 billion cubic meters target, which is quite ambitious, potentially reachable, but we are very, very, very far from it right now. I mean, not every country is as successful as France. We need also to have a better assessment about, when the few domestic gas fields which are going to come online are really going to come online and whether they can actually be at the enhanced capacity. Because I have been hearing about that project in Romania for quite a few years already, and I'm always wondering, sometimes I have to check, is it starting? Is it going to start? Is it still planned or is it under construction? And it doesn't help. And this is exactly, the kind of question that is going to come back to us coming from the LNG suppliers. So how much LNG do you need? Well, part of the answer is how much domestic gas do we have? And this is domestic natural gas plus biomethane. So again, more clarity on that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. I have three things. So I guess more realism from what I hear is needed as to what the situation is and the potential challenges that are still, lurking out there, the risks. Clarity. I think you mentioned that having that clarity to have the certainty is another one. And I'm not sure if I have actually a third one, but I was wondering if it's about, I'm tempted to say, you hinted at that slightly by looking at this in a different way. You said they were monitoring things much more closely than before.
But be prepared.
Being prepared, exactly.
Be prepared, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean,
preparation.
Security of supply is not going to go away, whatever. I mean, you can look at that from different perspectives, but it's going to be security of gas supply, it's going to be security of electricity, and at some point we are also going to need to look at the hydrogen as well. But, you need to do that knowing that climate change has, some impact on the energy demand and supply as well. So black swan scenarios have to be absolutely included now. Yeah.
Preparation and planning is probably the last one to add to the list. Listen, I want to thank you so much for coming here today. It was very interesting for me, and I'm sure it will be for our listeners as well. I'm looking forward to reading or hearing more of what you'll produce. I'm an avid reader of those and a big fan. So thanks again for the time. Thank you guys for listening and for watching. We'll see you soon in the next one. Thank you for your time as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me.
A pleasure.